Julie Gorte is waiting, SVP Sustainable Investment at Impax Asset Management. We're going to focus on climate risk, net zero, and opportunities for investors. I'm going to hand the floor over to Julie, and then I'm going to fire a few questions Julie's way in a few minutes. Julie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and it's really good to be here with you today. So climate change, net zero, and physical risk, that is a big topic, and it's one that everybody's talking about, but we haven't really done enough about it yet. So that's why we're still talking. We are seeing lots and lots of net zero pledges. The world seems to have absorbed the idea that we need, in order to avoid a climate catastrophe, to have net zero emissions by around mid-century sometime. We're probably not, even if we do that, which is going to be tough, we probably can't avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, of going above that, but we can still avoid 2 degrees. It's going to take a lot of commitment, and getting to net zero by 2050 is probably going to enable that to happen. But what is it going to take to get there? So we're seeing a lot of companies make net zero pledges. We're seeing other kinds of institutions make them as well, some cities, some nations. We're coming up on COP26. We hope to see that from more nations. We hope to see some muscle behind the commitments that companies do make. What's standing in the way? Are people really going to do what they said they would do? We're not seeing that yet with Paris. We have seen a reduction in emissions intensity for certain, but we've been seeing that for more than 10 years. In order for us to get to net zero, we're going to have to reduce absolute emissions. So if we want to grow, we're going to have to reduce intensity a whole lot more than we have done, really, to zero or net zero by the middle of the century. What we're seeing in a lot of the net zero commitments from companies and others right now is that they do almost all start with some kind of emissions reduction. Here's what we can do to reduce emissions. We can make more of our electricity renewable, or all of it. We can reduce emissions from these processes in this manner. There's always the whole, the low-hanging fruit of we'll replace all the light bulbs with LEDs and put zone lighting in all of our warehouses and things like that. That will get us part of the way there. When there's always this sort of, the stumbling block right now is the sort of reduce emissions that you can't reduce unless you do something really major. So in chemical plants, you may have to actually change your entire process in order to get to net zero. In order to build electric cars, we're seeing it's not a matter of converting old auto plants, it's building new ones. And it's building a lot of charging infrastructure. It's going to take some investment. Almost everybody then gets to the point where they say, okay, these are the ones that we don't really see a way, these are the emissions that we don't see a way to reduce right now. And so we're going to do offsets. And offsets can be great. We're going to need nature-based solutions, but most of the offsets that are out there right now probably aren't taking a molecule of carbon out of the atmosphere. A lot of them are so reinvesting in forest plantations that were established 20 years ago, and that's already counted. That's already in the current pathway. So in order for an offset to work, it's got to be additional, it's got to be permanent, it's got to not leak. And not very many offsets are actually like that. You can get them certified, and that provides more assurance to those who are investing in them that this is actually contributing to solving the problem. But right now, it is doubtful that many of the offsets that people are using are really doing that. We're also going to have to invest an awful lot more in solutions in terms of zero carbon. So we've done yeoman's work, really, in getting renewables to the point where they are competitive, or at least some of them. So onshore wind and solar PV and concentrating solar can be competitive with grid power. And especially coal, even gas, in many places. So we've accomplished a lot, but we're going to have to accomplish a lot more there. Some sectors that are going to be a whole lot more difficult to decarbonize than electricity production, and that is by no means done. So we're going to have to get even more committed to reducing electricity-based emissions, especially in places where they're still building coal plants, unfortunately. But decarbonizing things like air transport, even shipping, cement or concrete manufacture, aluminum, and a lot of other materials, that is a journey we have only just begun to embark on. We're either going to have alternative materials or really changed processes to produce aluminum in ways that are not terribly carbon intensive. So those are the sort of nuts that we have yet to crack, and those are the places that people are saying this is where we need offsets. So there's quite a journey ahead of us just in terms of reducing emissions, and we are not yet on a path to staying below 2 degrees. We're on a path to somewhere between 2 and 3, closer to 3 than 2. That's not good. So because we are on that path, the other thing we have to, all the stuff about emissions reduction is about avoiding the unmanageable. You want to avoid something that is really going to be difficult to deal with. The other half of what we have to do is managing the unavoidable. So we have probably 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 degrees warming that is going to happen. That is going to make our world a lot more like the recent past than the distant past. What I mean by that, so natural catastrophe losses that are insured have gone from about 240 some billion per year in the 1980s to 1.6 trillion in the 2010s, and they're still rising, and they tend to go up at least by one order of magnitude every decade or so. Actually, that's not right. They can double every decade or so. So we're getting to the point where these things are really taking a toll on us economically, and that's just the damage. In fact, in many cases, it's just the insured damage. We're also seeing raised insurance costs, so it's going to cost more to do everything that we do now if we want them to be insured against losses from things like floods, fires, sea level rise, droughts, coastal storms, extreme precipitation, and the expansion of pests and diseases from formerly tropical biomes to the temperate regions. So all of that stuff is going to be something we have to invest in, the adaptation to climate change, and we are not ready. So recently we undertook with a partner, that partner being the New York State Common Retirement Fund, to engage with every company in the S&P 500 about physical risk. And all we asked them to do was tell us where their significant assets were, because physical risk is more a matter of where you are than what you do. So, and a lot of companies in their 10Ks or 10Fs or 20Fs, their annual reporting will tell you we operate in China and California and Brazil and so forth. That is not precise enough to do a physical risk assessment that is more precise than basically assigning every single physical risk there is to a company. If you operate in California, you're going to have pretty much all of them. There's some parts of California that are vulnerable to drought, some that are vulnerable to fire, some that are vulnerable to sea level rise. There may even be some vulnerable to flooding. So you're not, by having those broad geographies, you can't really do a very good assessment of what risks you actually face. In order to do that, we are going to need to know a lot more about not only where the company's own assets are, but where key nodes in its supply chain are. Who do you depend on for, critical supplies? If you depend on Taiwan and Thailand for semiconductors to make your products, then they have water risk even if you don't. If you depend on ports for shipping your product, those ports are all at sea level. Just as an example of what can happen after Hurricane Katrina, the Port of New Orleans was shut down for a few days, and that raised U.S. food prices as a whole by about 3 or 4% until that port was back up and running and dealt with the backlog. So imagine that happening to many more ports more of the time for longer duration, and then you sort of have some idea of how much impact there could be. What do we need to do in order to adapt to physical risk? First of all, you have to understand what you're vulnerable to, and then say, all right, how can I decrease the vulnerability? There have been some examples of companies that have already done that. We found in the 70-some companies that we talked to in the S&P 500 over the past year, we found 3 that had actually given some thought to physical risk and had plans in place to cope with it. In short, most of us are not ready. We don't even know what's coming at us. A lot of companies are accustomed to thinking about climate change in terms of transition, risk and emissions, and if they're not big emitters, they may think they're invulnerable. And then maybe their headquarters burn up. That happened to Agilent with a headquarters that was in the Santa Rosa fire. You may be vulnerable to floods. Hewlett-Packard moved one of its campuses because after Hurricane Harvey, because it was too vulnerable to flooding. Con Edison in New York moved a lot of the electric infrastructure up 1 or 2 stories. It cost them $1 billion after Hurricane Sandy. And I think New York is getting ready to spend a lot more money trying to increase their resilience to things like Hurricane Ida, which just took a toll that they didn't expect to have from a hurricane that made landfall in the Gulf. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. We can do it if we have the right information and the will to invest in solutions.
Julie, brilliant. I mean, can we just go back to physical climate risks? Just explain to us on a simplistic basis, if we're discovering this, if we're learning about this, what it means and, why is it such a concern?
It's a concern because a lot of the assets that are vulnerable to physical risk are number in the trillions of dollars over the next few decades. And if we lose a lot, we tend to think about physical risk as being isolated events happening one at a time. But what we've seen this summer, I don't know, last month, if you open the paper on any given day, the impression you got was that half the world is burning and the other half is flooding, right? We had floods in Germany and Belgium and Tennessee and Louisiana and New York. And then we had fires in Turkey and Spain and the Mediterranean and Russia and California. And so we were seeing a lot of this actually happen in real time. So how do you understand where those were, whether you're vulnerable to those things? So that's climate modeling. They have a suite of models, or they actually have several suites of models that climate scientists use. The one that's being used now to assess physical risk is called CMIP5. And for nerds, I have nerd tattooed across my forehead, so I know what it stands for. That's the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. And if you run all those models, you can, and then downscale them, because the degree of resolution in those models is about half a degree of arc, which in some cases is adequate and many others isn't. You can get a picture of which of your assets or key points in your supply chain, value chain nodes are vulnerable to what risks. So you can get a picture of how much more flood risk you might incur if you are located in, say, Baton Rouge or Dresden or whatever. Or you can get a picture of how vulnerable you might be to drought. Now, all of those things depend now, I know I said earlier that physical risk depends on where you are rather than what you do. There is a little bit that depends on what you do. So if you need a lot of water, like you're a semiconductor manufacturer and you have plants in Arizona and the entire American Intermountain West is projected to be drier and hotter in the future, you can be sure that you're going to have increased water risk. It takes a lot of water to make semiconductors. They don't necessarily destroy it, but they use a lot. And if you don't have it, or if you're trying to compete with drinking water and hygiene for the population in the area, you're probably always going to lose. So that's the first thing, is to just assess, all right, what are the models telling me about all these places where I have key assets or key dependencies, and what's the rise in the risk? The next step is then say, all right, what can I do about it? Do I need to move something? Do I need to harden it? Do I need to put defenses in on the coastline? If you're in, just FYI, if you happen to be in Miami and you're vulnerable, you cannot possibly build enough seawalls to protect yourself. You just can't. I mean, you can maybe for a decade or two, and then after that, it's going to be water everywhere. So understanding what you might be able to do may require a lot of hard decision making. You also need to factor into that, what's insurance going to cost me? Because if anybody knows this stuff, it's the actuaries in the insurance and reinsurance companies. So they know what to charge you. They're starting to do it. We've seen fire insurance rates go up. So those are the kinds of things you need to think through when you're trying to assess physical risk.
So that's what companies should do when, as you say, Julie, to assess physical climate risk. What about investors? What about financial markets, policymakers? How should they approach it?
So one of the reasons that we did the engagement that we did was because for a portfolio manager or an asset owner, you want to at least understand what the risk looks like in your portfolio. So you start with a physical risk assessment. And if you don't have enough information from companies, you ask them for that. So that was for us, that was kind of step one. We also petitioned the SEC to make that kind of reporting mandatory. They may even do it. For insurers, a lot of it involves, it's kind of the same calculus, only in the end, you're not deciding necessarily, you may be deciding who to invest in and who not to, but you're also trying to decide who or how to price your product. Primarily property and casualty, but it could also be D&O, any other kind of insurance as well. Banks, what do you want to underwrite? What kind of risk are you willing to take in terms of underwriting? And especially if you're not just originating loans, if you actually have a loan portfolio, you want to understand the repayment risk or the default risk that may come with what you've invested in. And then, because so much of this stuff is happening simultaneously in many places within and between countries, I think the central banks have a role, and increasingly they're stepping up. We've seen the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a network of central banks around the world that thinks about physical risk, about climate risk, really, about the whole thing, starting to do things like requiring stress testing. So far, the European banks, I think the French and British banks that have actually conducted stress tests with respect to physical risk have shown that it is not insurmountable by any means. It's not even that bad at the moment. But are those stress tests really adequate to the problem that we're facing? That's a different question. So it may be that you need to design stress tests that are much more like what the real world will be. The other thing that central banks can consider is to change their asset purchase programs, not to follow the principle that they now follow with market neutrality, but to actually invest in solutions in their asset purchase programs. So far, we haven't really seen any central banks do that. But to the extent that the asset purchase programs for things like quantitative easing end up investing in zombie firms that are, fracking and trying to get natural gas out of the ground and don't earn enough money to pay off their debt, might not be the best course of action.
Well said. Brilliantly finished. Thank you, Julie, for an incredibly compelling overview to start with of where we are and our goal to reach 1.5 degrees by mid-century, but also just telling us everything we need to know, companies, regulators, policymakers, about physical climate risk. Brilliant. Thank you so much. See you soon, Julie. So good. Brilliant. Penultimate presentation on this day 3 of the Sustainable Investment Forum North America. Our climate leaders insight there with Julie. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much to Julie. And if you want anything else, if you want to hear anything else, if you want to fire more questions Julie's way, Impax Asset Management's way, do visit their virtual expo, connect with their team. That's why it's there. Please do so. Lots to learn from all of us, and from all of us both ways, both to Impax and from Impax as well. So please do connect with Impax, connect with Julie on our virtual expo. Connect with her, connect with the team as well.